It was one of those afternoons when the house seemed bigger than life itself. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows, leaving long golden streaks on the hardwood floors. The faint hum of the air conditioner was the only sound that kept me company as I folded laundry on the couch, my fingers moving naturally, the rhythm of the task so ingrained that I barely needed to think about it. But my mind was far from quiet. I couldn't recall the last time Greg had kissed me. A genuine kiss that left you breathless and wanting more, rather than a quick goodbye on his way to work. Even though it had been years, the pain of missing it was still present. My husband had become a stranger in our own home, preoccupied with endless meetings, emails, and the glow of his phone screen. His absence was not physical, but it felt very real. I caught my reflection in the window, the late afternoon sun highlighting the fine lines that were forming around my eyes. At 33, I was neither old nor the carefree girl I once saw in the mirror. My hand moved instinctively to smooth the strap of my camisole, feeling the lace catch on my skin. The fabric clung to me in a way that felt both comforting and teasing. For a moment, I allowed myself to wonder, when was the last time someone noticed me? And then there was Nathan. He'd been living with us for a few months now, since he graduated from college and returned to save money while looking for work. At 22, he was everything Greg had once been, vibrant, full of life, and confident without even trying. His presence had initially served as a reminder of the distance between my husband and me, but it had recently evolved into something entirely different. I noticed how his laughter filled the house and how his eyes lit up when he discussed his future plans. And though I tried not to think about it, I noticed how his t-shirts clung to his chest and how his cologne lingered faintly in the air after he died. It was wrong to think about him in that way, I knew it was, but the heart does not follow the rules of right and wrong. The sound of footsteps interrupted my reverie. Nathan was in the kitchen, searching through the refrigerator. I could hear the clink of glass bottles and the soft shuffle of his bare feet across the tile. The house suddenly felt warmer and the air heavier, as if his mere presence could change the atmosphere. "Nathan," I said, my voice steady, revealing none of the turmoil raging inside me. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, his tall figure backlit by the kitchen light. He was dressed in a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly tousled as if he had just awoken from a nap. "Could you please help me with something?" "Sure," he said easily, entering the room. His casual confidence only heightened the magnetic pull I felt for him. I turned away from him, fumbling with the bra clasp beneath my camisole. "The strap keeps slipping," I explained, my voice softening to a whisper. "Could you please tighten it for me?" There was a pause, a hesitation that lingered in the air like the final note of a song about to fade. And then I heard him move closer. My breath caught as I felt his hands brush against my shoulders, his fingers grazing the thin strap as he tightened it. His touch was firm but careful, deliberate, and sent shivers down my spine. "Is this all right?" he inquired, his voice low, almost a murmur. "Yes," I responded, barely audible. The room felt impossibly small, the distance between us shrinking with each passing second. His fingers lingered a little too long, and I could feel the heat of his breath on the back of my neck. It was intoxicating how something so simple could rekindle a flame that had been smoldering inside me for so long. As he stepped back, I turned to face him, my hands instinctively reaching to tighten the strap, even though it was perfectly fine. Our gazes met, and for the first time, I noticed something in his eyes that mirrored my feelings, an unspoken tension, a question neither of us dared to ask. "Thanks," I said, breaking the silence, but my tone lacked the casualness I'd used in any other situation. "No problem," he said, his voice equally subdued. But he did not move. He stood there, his gaze moving briefly to the neckline of my camisole before returning to mine. The moment dragged on, full of unspoken words neither of us had the courage, or the recklessness, to express. And then, as if the universe itself was attempting to break the spell, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound brought us both back to reality, and he quickly reached for it, muttering something about having to take a call as he exited the room. I stood there for a long time after he left, my heart pounding in my chest and my mind replaying every detail of what had just occurred. It must have been innocent. But the way my skin tingled where he touched me, and my body seemed to hum with energy I hadn't felt in years, told me otherwise. Later that evening, as I lay alone in bed, the memory of his touch lingered. I tried to close my eyes and will the thoughts away, but they wouldn't stop. Deep down, beneath the layers of guilt and doubt, a question began to form. If something so small could feel so powerful, what would happen if we stopped pretending it didn't exist? The house had always been quiet, but now it seemed alive with possibilities, each moment carrying the weight of what could happen next. That afternoon, the house was unusually quiet, to the point where every creak of the floorboards and distant hum of the refrigerator seemed amplified. I was in my bedroom, standing in front of the mirror, trying to fix the strap of my favorite black bra. It had always been temperamental, slipping just enough to remind me that it was not perfect, much like so many other things in my life. But today, the strap seemed more defiant than usual. I tugged on it, twisting my arm awkwardly behind my back, but the clasp would not budge. My reflection stared back at me, offering an unspoken challenge in my own eyes. Ask for assistance. It was not something I did frequently. Greg wasn't home, he never seemed to be, and I'd almost forgotten to ask for help. But today was different. Today, the loneliness felt heavier, like a shadow that reached too far and swallowed the light. And then I heard Nathan's footsteps down the hall, the familiar shuffle of his sneakers on the carpet. I didn't think, I simply called out, "Nathan." A pause. The sound of his footsteps ceased, then moved closer. "Yeah." His voice was casual and unconcerned, but there was a warmth to it that I had not noticed before. "I need a favor," I said, turning toward the doorway as he approached. He leaned against the frame, one hand resting on the edge, his broad shoulders taking up the space. His t-shirt clung to him in a way that felt intentional, but I knew it wasn't. It was just Nathan, relaxed, confident, and effortlessly present. "What's up?" he inquired, his brow furrowing slightly as his gaze met mine. I paused for a moment as the words caught in my throat. But I persevered, keeping my tone light and casual. "This strap," I explained, gesturing to my shoulder. "It is driving me crazy. Can you fix it for me?" The request hung in the air between us, like an invisible thread pulled taut. His expression changed slightly, with his brows raising in surprise before settling into something more unreadable. "Ah, sure," he replied, entering the room. I turned my back on him, suddenly hyper-aware of everything. The way the afternoon light caught the curve of my neck, the faint scent of his cologne as he came closer, the sound of his breathing, steady but just a touch heavier than before. My skin tingled as his hands brushed against my shoulder, his fingers tentative at first, then more certain as he worked the clasp. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice softening to a whisper. "Yes," I said, barely audible. The air around us felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. His fingers were warm, and his touch was both careful and firm, as if he was balancing on the edge of something fragile. I closed my eyes for a moment, allowing the sensation to wash over me. A simple touch, but it felt like a lifeline. "There," he said after a moment, taking a small step back. "I think that should do it." I turned to face him, my hand instinctively reaching to adjust the strap again, even though it didn't need to be adjusted. Our eyes met, and for a split second, everything else faded away, the room, the light, the quiet hum of the house. There was only the intensity in his gaze, a look that seemed to see right through me, past the carefully constructed walls I'd built around myself. "Thanks," I said, my voice more stable than I expected. "No problem," he replied. But he didn't move. He stood there, his hands at his sides, his eyes flickering briefly to the strap before meeting mine again. The moment stretched, heavy and electric, until his phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the spell. He fumbled for it, muttering an apology as he glanced at the screen. "I'll take this," he said, backing toward the door. But even as he left, his gaze lingered for a moment, as if he didn't want to go. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers brushing against the strap of my bra, now perfectly in place. But it wasn't the strap I was thinking about, it was the way his hands had felt against my skin, the way his eyes had looked at me, not just as his stepmother, but as a woman. The thought lingered, unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about Nathan, it was about me, about as I lay in bed that night. I replayed the moment in my mind, every detail as vivid as if it were happening all over again. The way his fingers had hesitated before finding their confidence, the way his voice had softened when he asked if it was okay, the way his eyes had lingered, filled with something I couldn't name but didn't want to deny. I knew I should feel guilty and push the thoughts away, but I didn't. The days after that moment seemed to stretch endlessly, as if time itself had slowed, forcing me to sit with the thoughts I didn't want to admit, even to myself. I tried to distract myself with chores, losing myself in the familiar rhythm of folding laundry, wiping countertops, and watering the plants on the back porch, but the memory of Nathan's touch lingered, like the faintest trace of perfume, subtle but impossible to ignore. When I next saw him, it was late afternoon, and the sunlight was streaming through the living room windows, casting golden streaks across the floor as I sat curled up on the couch, a book open in my lap. I wasn't really reading, my eyes scanned the words, but my mind was elsewhere. I could hear him moving around in the kitchen, the clink of glasses, and the low hum of a podcast he was half listening to. "Hey," he said, appearing in the doorway with a glass of iced tea in hand. He hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room, his presence immediately filling the space and making the air feel heavier. "You look comfortable," he said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I looked down at myself, bare feet tucked beneath me, an oversized sweater draped loosely over my shoulders. I didn't feel comfortable, but rather vulnerable and exposed. "It's a good day for being lazy," I replied, trying to keep my tone light and casual, though my heart was pounding in my chest. He laughed softly, a low warm sound that made something deep inside me stir. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the opposite end of the couch. "Of course not," I said, though the words felt too quick, too eager. I shifted slightly, making room for him as he settled in, the cushions sinking under his weight. He stretched out his long legs, brushing against mine as he got comfortable, and it sent a shiver up my spine, which I hoped he didn't notice. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the rustle of pages as I pretended to read, but the tension between us was palpable, an invisible thread pulling tighter with each passing moment. I could feel his gaze on me, not constant but lingering, as if he was trying to figure something out but wasn't ready to ask the question. "Claire," he said abruptly, breaking the silence. His voice was softer, almost hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," I said, but the word caught in my throat. He hesitated, running his hand through his hair in a nervous manner. "The other day, when I helped you with your strap, was that weird for you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. I felt my cheeks flush, heat rising to my face as I tried to find the right words. "No," I finally said, though it came out softer than I intended. "It wasn't weird. Just unexpected." "Yeah," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "Unexpected." He repeated the word as if he was tasting its meaning and figuring out where it fit in the space between us. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The room felt too quiet, the distance between us both vast and non-existent. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine again, this time not by accident. "Claire," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now, his eyes searching mine, and for the first time, I recognized something in them that I couldn't ignore: vulnerability, a longing that mirrored mine. I reached for the book in my lap, closing it slowly and setting it aside. My hand lingered for a moment, hovering over the cushion between us, before I let it rest there, close enough to feel the warmth of his leg against my fingers. His breath caught just slightly, and I realized how close we were, how the smallest movement could close the gap entirely. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. "Nathan," I said softly, my voice trembling but steady enough to break the silence. But before I could say anything else, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Greg's voice echoed from the hallway, calling out cheerfully, "I'm home." Nathan drew back as quickly as if he had been burned, his expression shifting instantly to one of practiced neutrality. I grabbed the book from the cushion, flipping it open and pretending to read, though the words on the page blurred. Greg entered the room a moment later, his smile wide and oblivious. "Hey, you two," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door. "What's going on?" "Nothing much," I replied, forcing a smile as I looked up at him. "Just relaxing." Nathan's hands fidgeted against his thighs as if trying to ground himself. Greg's attention did not linger. He kissed my forehead absently before heading toward the kitchen, leaving us alone again. For a long moment, neither of us moved, the weight of what had almost happened pressing down on us. Nathan stood, his movements quick and deliberate, as he left the room. I remained where I was, my fingers gripping the book tightly as I tried to steady my breathing. My mind was racing, the memory of his gaze, his touch, burned into my skin. Whatever this was, whatever it meant, I knew one thing for certain: it wasn't over. Not even close. What had begun as a quiet moment had become something far more complicated, and the thought of what might happen next was as terrifying as it was thrilling. The storm inside me had been building for days, if not weeks, and tonight it felt like it was about to erupt. The house was shrouded in a peculiar stillness, the kind that comes when everything is on the verge of change. The power had gone out unexpectedly, leaving the rooms bathed in flickering candlelight. Shadows danced along the walls like silent spectators to my turmoil, shifting with every faint draft. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the living room, a deck of cards spread out before me. Playing solitaire by candlelight felt like an act of desperation, a way to keep my hands and my mind busy, but it wasn't working. My thoughts kept drifting unbidden, to the way Nathan's hand had brushed against mine earlier that day, a fleeting touch that left a trail of heat in its wake. He was in the kitchen now, rummaging through the fridge for something to drink. "His thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the flicker of the candle closest to me. But I could feel him watching me, his presence as tangible as the humid air that clung to my skin. "You're welcome," he replied, his tone equally subdued, and leaned back on his hands, stretching his legs out in front of him. The movement was casual and unassuming, but my eyes betrayed me, catching on the way his t-shirt rode up slightly, revealing a sliver of taut, sun-kissed skin above his waistband. I forced myself to look away, but the image was already etched in my mind. "Power outages always feel so strange," I said, filling the silence. "Like the world just stops for a while." "Yeah," he said, keeping his gaze fixed on me. "Everything feels different when it's quiet like this." The weight of his words settled between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I shuffled the deck of cards absent-mindedly, the sound of the thin paper brushing together filling the void, and Nathan reached for a card from the pile, flipping it over and carefully placing it down. "Solitaire?" he inquired, a faint smile forming at the corners of his mouth. "Just trying to pass the time," I said, returning his smile with a tentative one of my own. He leaned in slightly, close enough for me to feel the faint warmth radiating from him. His scent, clean with a hint of something woodsy, washed over me, and I had to fight the urge to close my eyes and let it envelop me completely. The air between us seemed to thicken with each passing second, and the candles cast flickering shadows that felt almost conspiratorial. Nathan's voice trailed off as he fidgeted with a playing card. "Do you ever feel like—" The question caught me off guard, its simplicity belied the gravity of what he was asking. I met his gaze for the first time that evening, my heart pounding furiously in my chest. His gaze was steady, searching for an answer I wasn't sure I could provide. "I think change is unavoidable," I finally stated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Even when we're not ready for it." He slowly nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "Yeah, that makes sense." The space between us felt impossibly small now, charged with an energy I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. My pulse quickened as his hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to mine. It was a small gesture, easily dismissed as accidental, but the intention behind it was unmistakable. "Claire," he said quietly, my name a whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't respond. My throat felt tight, and my thoughts were tangled with fear and longing. Then, as if pulled by some invisible force, his fingers brushed against mine, sending a jolt of electricity through me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, but I didn't pull away. The candles flickered wildly, their flames bending and twisting as if caught in the same storm that raged inside me. Nathan's hand remained where it was, his touch light but deliberate, his gaze searching mine for permission, or perhaps absolution. I couldn't look away, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but sit there and let the moment wash over me. "It's okay," he said softly. "If you don't want." I wanted it in a way that scared me, made my skin tingle, and made my heart race. I didn't know what to say, so I reached for him, my fingers curling around his, a silent answer to the question he hadn't asked. As the anticipation grew, a distant thunderclap echoed through the house, reminding us of the ongoing storm outside. Nathan drew back slightly, his expression changing to one of quiet understanding. "We should probably check the candles," he said, his voice steadier now, but his eyes betrayed the turmoil that was still raging inside him. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaky but firm. "We should." As he stood and began gathering the candles, I remained on the floor, my fingers still tingling from his touch, knowing that whatever this was, whatever it meant, it was far from over. The storm had passed for the time being, but the aftermath was just getting started. The night had been quiet, but the echoes of what had transpired were anything but. Something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. Deep down, I knew that the true storm was still waiting to break. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the television, casting shifting patterns of light across the walls. The movie played on, the dialogue barely registering as background noise, though I couldn't recall the title or the plot. Nathan had been unusually quiet since dinner, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a tension that mirrored my own. I stole a glance at him, my eyes tracing the lines of his profile, the sharpness of his jaw, the way the flickering light caught the curve of his lips. He appeared lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the screen but unfocused, as if he were somewhere else entirely. "I can change the movie if you're bored," I said, breaking the silence. My voice sounded more steady than I felt. He looked at me, his expression softening slightly. "No, it's fine. I'm just distracted." "Distracted by what?" I inquired, unsure if I wanted to know. I felt my breath catch as his gaze lingered on mine for too long. There was that unspoken tension, the invisible thread that seemed to bind us together in ways I couldn't fully understand but couldn't deny. He hesitated, as if weighing his words, before finally replying, "Nothing important," but his expression told a different story. I leaned back against the couch, my fingers curling around the edge of the blanket draped over my lap. The room felt warmer than it should have, and the air was thick with something I couldn't quite name. My heart was pounding, and I hated how obvious it felt, as if he could hear or feel it even from where he sat. I wanted to say something to break the spell, but the words wouldn't come. Nathan moved closer, causing my pulse to quicken and the tension between us to crackle like static electricity. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen as a woman, not as a wife or stepmother. "Claire," he said quietly, my name a whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I turned to him, my heart racing. His expression was unreadable, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't identify. The movie continued to play, its sounds fading into the background, replaced by the steady rhythm of my breathing and the deafening thud of my heartbeat. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said carefully and deliberately, "but I can't stop thinking about." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The impact of his words and silence was palpable between us. My mind raced, a whirlwind of ideas and emotions that I couldn't untangle. I knew I needed to stop whatever was going on before it escalated. But I couldn't bring myself to move, speak, or do anything except sit there and wait to see what happened next. "Nathan," I said, my voice trembling. "This is not. We shouldn't." "I know," he replied quickly, cutting me off. "I understand we shouldn't. But that does not change how I feel." His confession hit me like a wave, crashing over me and dragging me down. I felt exposed and vulnerable, but I also wanted to immerse myself in the intense experience. His gaze met mine, and I saw the same conflict reflected there: fear, desire, guilt, and something achingly close to hope. Before I could say anything, he reached for my hand, his touch light yet deliberate. My breath caught as his fingers brushed against mine, and the warmth of his skin sent a shock through me. I should have backed away, but I did not. Instead, I allowed him to take my hand, his grip firm but gentle, as if he was afraid I would disappear. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I can't pretend this isn't real." His words lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. My mind told me to stop, pull away, and say something to put an end to this madness. But my body betrayed me, leaning into his touch, craving the connection I had not felt in a long time. The distance between us vanished as he approached, his face inches from mine. I could feel his warm, steady breath on my skin, and his scent, clean, masculine, intoxicating, filled my senses. My heart pounded so loudly that I was certain he could hear it. But he didn't back away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze fixed on mine, and time appeared to stand still. "Nathan," I whispered, holding his gaze despite my trembling voice. He did not respond, but his eyes spoke volumes. He leaned in slowly and cautiously, his lips brushing against mine in a tentative kiss, almost as if he was waiting for me to stop him. But I did not. Instead, I closed my eyes and lost myself in the moment, in the warmth of his touch, in the way his hand cupped my face so gently that my heart ached. The kiss intensified, becoming bolder and more certain, and I felt something within me break free, a dam that had been holding back years of longing, frustration, and loneliness. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping them tightly as if he were the only thing keeping me steady. The world around us faded away, leaving only the two of us and the electricity crackling between us. But just as quickly as it began, it ended. Nathan drew back, his breathing ragged, his eyes searching mine with a mix of fear and desire. "We can't," he said quietly. "I don't want to hurt you, or him." I nodded, my breath shaky, and said, I know, though the words felt hollow. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, and I knew there was no turning back. The line had been crossed, and the consequences were just beyond the horizon. The silence that followed was deafening, full of everything we couldn't say. As I sat there, my heart still racing, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next and if we'd be able to survive it. I sat at the edge of my bed, the quiet of the house pressing in on me like a weight. I couldn't shake the events of the night before, played on a relentless loop in my mind, each moment sharper than the last. The warmth of Nathan's hand, the taste of his kiss, the way he had pulled back, his eyes filled with regret and something far more dangerous. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made my heart skip a beat, and I straightened instinctively, smoothing the hem of my shirt as if it would somehow erase the evidence of what had happened. The door creaked open, and there he was, Nathan. His expression was carefully blank, though his eyes betrayed the storm raging just beneath the surface. Morning, he said, his voice soft but steady. Morning, I said, my voice a little too high and quick. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything we weren't saying, until he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him with a soft click. Claire, he said, his tone hesitant, as if he didn't know where to begin. We need to talk. I know, I said quickly, gripping the bed's edge. But I don't know what there is to say. There's plenty to say, he replied, his voice firm but not harsh. He took one step closer, then another, until he was standing in front of me. Last night, it can't happen again. I nodded, the words like a dagger in my chest. I know. But knowing doesn't make it any easier, he said, softening his expression. It doesn't change how I feel. My breath caught, and I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Nathan, we can't do this. It's wrong. It's complicated. Everything worth feeling is complicated, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. He reached out then, brushing his hand against mine in a brief touch that could have been accidental, but it wasn't. But I can't pretend this isn't real. I closed my eyes, his words cutting through me like a blade. He was right. It was real, in a terrifying way. But real didn't make it right or safe. We can't keep doing this, I said, my voice trembling. If Greg finds out, He's too preoccupied with work to notice anything that's going on here, Nathan interjected, his tone suddenly sharp. That doesn't make it okay, I shot back, frustrated. You're his son. Stepson, he clarified, his voice tight, and I'm an adult. So are you. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room felt impossibly small. I turned away, my hands trembling as I gripped the back of the chair by the window. The sunlight felt cruel now, too bright and too exposing. This isn't just about us, I finally said, barely audible. It's about everything else, Greg, this house, our lives. It's about what we want, he countered softly, and maybe it's about what we deserve. I turned to face him, my heart aching from the weight of his words. His eyes searched mine, and I saw in them the same conflict that had been tearing me apart, guilt, desire, and fear. He took a step closer, and I stayed still. Claire, he said, whispering my name and sending a shiver down my spine. Tell me you don't feel it. Tell me you don't want this. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words emerged. I could not tell him that. I could not lie. Not to him. Not to myself. His hand reached out again, this time gently cupping my cheek, making my heart ache. His thumb brushed against my skin, and I found myself leaning into his touch, craving the connection that I had been denying for so long. I can't do this, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Yes, you can, he said softly. We both can. Before I could respond, the sound of a car door slamming outside shattered the moment. My heart jumped into my throat, and I pulled away from him, panic coursing through my veins. It's Greg, I said, my voice urgent. Nathan took a step back, his expression a mix of frustration and resignation. We'll talk later, he said firmly. I nodded, my mind racing as I moved to the door, my hand gripping the doorknob like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I heard the front door open and Greg's voice calling out as he entered the house. Hey honey, he called, his tone cheerful and oblivious. I smiled as I stepped into the hallway, away from the storm that was still raging behind me. But even as I greeted him, my heart was back in that room, with Nathan, with the choices we had yet to make. The quiet moments of the day ahead would be nothing but a prelude to the chaos that was waiting to unfold. And deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning of a story that would not end here, led by his tone, cheerful and oblivious. I smiled as I stepped into the hallway, away from the storm that was still raging behind me. But even as I greeted him, my heart was back in that room, with Nathan, with the choices we had yet to make. The quiet moments of the day ahead would be nothing but a prelude to the chaos that was waiting to unfold. And deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning of a story that would not end here. I smiled as I stepped into the hallway, away from the storm that was still raging behind me. But even as I greeted him, my heart was back in that room, with Nathan, with the choices we had yet to make. The quiet moments of the day ahead would be nothing but a prelude to the chaos that was waiting to unfold. And deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning of a story that would not end here.